Progress.
Did you all have any? Did you remember any of the Negroes singing in the fields and his songs out there and the songs they like to sing when they're out in the field?
I hear him singing Old Black Joe in the field.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I cried a boy singing Old Black Joe. That song he sing, Gone am the day when my heart was young and free. Gone am the friend from the cotton fields away. Gone from this world to a better world I know. I heard a gentle voice of calling, oh, Black Joe, I am coming, keep a coming, for my head am bending low. I heard a gentle voice of calling, oh, Black Joe. Yes, you got a man time to feel.
Through the 1930s and 40s in the United States, part of the Works Progress Administration of the New Deal and the Franklin Roosevelt's administration, all kinds of things. But one of the major projects was to interview former slaves. We have audio recordings of these interviews. Of course, most of them were kids about the time when they were lived in slavery, about the time of emancipation. But there are a whole bunch of these you can find online now, and they are just riveting to listen to. Most of them have captions because the accents can be pretty thick and hard to follow. But wow, what voices from the past. And then once in a while, they break into song, like Mr. George Johnson did in this one I just played for you, interview from September of 1941, talking about the song he would sing in the fields, Old Black Joe. And so I thought that was a good way to open with a discussion of the three races in America. The Anglo-Americans, which is, of course, Tocqueville's major focus, as you can imagine. But what about American blacks and American Indians? Let's consider them today. Tocqueville leaves no stone unturned as he describes the American Republic as it was at the time. And like we said, he describes a lot of things that really haven't changed and probably never will. Obviously, slavery ended and there was a civil rights movement. Things have improved drastically for Black Americans. Native Americans have their own unique set of struggles, as we know, reservation life. But all in all, what do the three races offer each other? And how is it that we are stuck together? And what do we do to make the best of the situation that we are given with each other? Well, what are the worst situations? We'll look at that as well. So yeah, let's consider Tocqueville's wonderful discussion of the three races, and then his broader discussion too of what are the chances of the Federal Republic of the United States lasting? Uh, what are the dangers to it? He's already mentioned tyranny of the majority, and no surprise, slavery and treatment of Native Americans are probably the most brutal expressions of tyranny of the majority. But despite that, if it endures, where does it go? What does the future look like? What is the present state and the future prospects for the three races in America? Let's consider that today. As we saw at the end of the last chapter, Tocqueville really emphasizes what he calls mores as the most important thing that makes American democracy work, that makes it everything it is. And as we know, mores can be bad. It can also be the reason American democracy fails if we have a different set of mores. Again, to define them clearly, what do we mean by mores? We're talking about social habits. And he'll kind of catalog them in volume 2, like we said, and talk about the things that seem to make American democracy work, particularly among Anglo-Americans. But here he thinks about race in much the same context. And in saying that, he means to point out that culture and these mores and these social habits are way more important for who a people are than race itself. He doesn't buy into the racial theories of his time or that existed after his time. It really is a set of habits and traditions and customs that happen to align with racial qualities and with appearance of people, of course, but they're not exactly the same thing. So as we think about race on Tocqueville's terms, we'll consider them in light of of mores as well as laws. So I have a lot to say about laws, but really it's about those mores again and again. Says, yeah, I've discussed all that, page 146, mores and laws and everything, but I haven't touched on race specifically. He's mentioned blacks a few times, but here he says I'm going to talk about them directly along with Native Americans. In the course of this work, he says, bottom of 146, my subject has often led me to speak of the Indians and the Negroes, but I have never had the time to stop in order to show what position was occupied by these two races in the midst of democratic peoples that I was busy describing. Slow down and consider them too. What is their place in this story? And what do they mean, he says in 147, for the endurance of the Union? So in saying that, he can say what was on a lot of people's minds. Could the situation, especially over slavery, lead to civil war? He didn't perceive Native Americans as a significant threat to the Union. The Union was much more of a threat to them, of course. But slavery, though, as an institution, could this divide the country? He really called it in saying that. These objects, he says in 147, touch upon my subject, but do not enter into it. They are American without being democratic. Right? So we're going to set aside the democracy and the mores and all of that. And it is above all democracy whose portrait I want to make. Initially, therefore, I had to put them aside, but now I will return to them in finishing. And so he does. What does he have to say about the three races? Did they choose to live alongside of each other? Definitely not, right? It was never a decision on the part of anybody to have this intermingling and this interaction that the three races have. Had it been up to slaves captured on the coast of West Africa, they would never have been captured, and they would have gone back. Had it been up to Native Americans, they would have lived on their ancestral land as they had for centuries. Had it been up to white Europeans, North America just would have been a wide open, empty continent, but it wasn't. Plus, as far as slavery went, it was the early settlers, remember, in the colonies who first brought the slaves over. And then in a lot of ways, later Americans, later white Americans, kind of perceived slavery as forced onto them by their predecessors, in some cases, their direct ancestors. So yeah, it was a situation that none of these people would have chosen had they had a choice. It was largely forced onto them. And that was how it was largely looked at. And what's amazing, I mean, even if you read like the writings of defenders of slavery, that's pretty much the way they describe slavery itself, that we're stuck with it. All we do is make the best of it. And so they justify it, with racial theories and whatnot. So the structure of this chapter is a little strange. You might notice he skips around a lot. So we'll kind of skip around in order to keep the topics together. But in general, he makes some interesting comparisons between the situation of blacks and Native Americans. What does he have to say about them on page 149? If you can compare the situation of the two, it's an interesting contrast between these groups. He observes the fact that Native Americans enjoy immense liberty, in a lot of ways, even more liberty than Anglo-Americans do. Yeah, they've got their rights and their constitutionalism and their democracy and all that, but that's not nearly the same as tribal life, where freedom is a lot more radical, a lot more, everybody is way more independent. The way that early settlers and early explorers described, including like Lewis and Clark, if you read their memoirs that came all the way out here to North Dakota and then to the Pacific coast, the tribes they came into contact with, they often said that every individual really was like his own sovereign self. The chief was really just kind of a representative of the tribe. And Lewis and Clark kind of marveled at that and said, wow, I mean, it's not really like that for us. I mean, yeah, we've got our rights and our freedoms, but it comes with all these duties and moral expectations that are kind of rigid that Native Americans don't necessarily live with. I kind of envy that. Right? Says your typical white settler or trapper or something. And that's partly the allure of the West, is that they don't have the same moral, rigid expectations. Liberty is very, very radical. For the slave, it's completely the opposite. There's no freedom at all. There's a kind of idleness to slavery, despite hard work, but when there's downtime, it's just nothing, just idleness. But that's nothing like freedom. So yeah, the two races are quite opposite of each other in that respect. And of course, it's Anglo-Americans in the middle. Notice too how Indians have just nothing but disdain, he says at page 149, to Anglo-American civilization. They just want nothing of it. Some will adapt to it once in a while, some will assimilate, but then they'll go back to their ancestral customs and ways. They just find Anglo-American civilization stuffy and oppressive, and they want nothing to do with it. Slaves, he says, want to be part of it. They desire to be more and more integrated into the civilization that surrounds them. They can't, obviously, because of racism and because of just what the institution of slavery was, but they want it. That's another interesting contrast he makes. And so Tocqueville also adds to just the mentality of the way that Native Americans retain this tremendous sense of self-respect, even in their most degraded moments, moved off their land, mistreated, massacred. That was in Tocqueville's time, but later you had massacres. Nonetheless, always having this tremendous self-respect derived from a heritage. Slaves have none of that. Their heritage is just all broken up and they're regarded as property. They do find ways to assert their pride and their sense of dignity in other ways. We'll get to that, but it's sort of made up once they're here, whereas Native Americans have it handed to them by their ancestors. So yeah, a very interesting set of contrasts he makes on page 149. And like I said, we'll skip around a bit in this chapter because Tocqueville is a little scattered in his thinking. But what does he have to say, first of all, about the present and the future of Native Americans? He calls them Indians specifically. Well, as far as the present goes, and this gets worse and worse in the future, they are in this state of constant displacement, always moved off their land, always bumped further west, further west, further west. Sometimes at the outcome of a war, like the Creek Wars that Andrew Jackson fought in, sometimes quite legally through treaties that seem to promise that if you just move over that hill, your tribe will be left alone forever. The Americans will never bother you. And then just, a couple of years later, more settlers, more white settlers come in. Then what? So the displacement is just this constant thing that causes great suffering for these tribes, moved away from the land where their forefathers are buried, where they've always been from time immemorial. And so it causes them to feel that detachment. Now, what's unusual is, didn't Tocqueville say the very same thing about white Americans, especially New Englanders? Their tendency to go west because of those inheritance laws. Obviously, the difference is white Americans do it voluntarily. Native Americans do not do it voluntarily. But still, it's something that they share. And we'll see slaves are in a similar situation. They too can't really put down roots. They can never really be in one place because the possibility of being sold off is always there. And so it's funny to think the three races have this in common, but only one actually chooses it. The white people do. But what else? He mentions the fact that their original mores, that sense of honor that they carry from their tribal identity, is largely corrupted by white Americans in a variety of ways. Aside from the government, you had land speculators, and this was a really common thing by the middle of the 19th century. They could see, okay, all this land, it's going to be developed soon, and so they would get Native Americans to sell it for way less than it was actually worth, but they didn't know. And then all of a sudden, settlers come in, but it's all protected under legal deed, and so there's really no grounds of complaint. Plus, just the allure of American stuff, of white American stuff, particularly whiskey. Native Americans have a sort of genetic disposition to just encounter whiskey once and find themselves completely addicted, very much like the way Chinese are with opium. And after the Opium Wars in the 1850s, the fact that you just saw Chinese society demolished by the pushing of opium onto them. Similar situation here. Just one encounter with whiskey, and you created a whole new class of really severe alcoholics. But all the while, too, Tocqueville points out this was all done legally, and in some cases, even benevolently. Not only would they be moved off their land by the federal government, but then missionaries would be funded by the government to come in and spread Christianity. And it was all very well intentioned on the part of these missionaries and a deep desire in them to initiate these poor lost souls into civilization, not just Christianity, but civilization broadly. So it refers back to what he said earlier, the way that Americans tend to conflate liberty with Christianity. So too, civilization and Christianity, they all seem to come together. These famous photographs of members of tribes converted and then made westernized and then sort of losing everything about their cultural, their ancestral heritage. And so, mentioned legally too, the fact that it was always within the bounds of law, with the exception of land speculators, but it was always this understanding this is a treaty and the federal government will promise you your land, right? And then they would break it. And even when they broke it, a lot of times it was justified by other federal laws. It's a long, complicated story, but he contrasts this all with the Spanish. They just came in and brutalized tribes, every single one they came into contact with. Americans, though, despite the harsh treatment, always tended to do it with a sense of goodwill, wishing the best for these tribes, even as they turned right around and took their land and pushed them further west and further west. Tocqueville says so much of this happened without any bloodshed, without any trouble. Now, of course, that changes later. You're aware of the Indian Wars of the 1870s, 1880s. Those were bloody. But at this time, it just seemed like it was this very cool, legal, systematic way of just pushing them out, pushing them out, pushing them further west again and again. It so happens when Tocqueville was in the United States, he was here at a very eventful moment, 1831. This was the period when the Trail of Tears was underway. It's a interesting story because this is the only time in American history where you saw an American president act pursuant to not his own executive authority, not an act of Congress, but a state. The state of Georgia wanted the Cherokees out of their territory, and Andrew Jackson felt obliged to do it. And so he ordered the army to go out there and relocate all these Cherokees from their ancestral land, that region around northern Georgia, a little bit of North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and push them out west. And so they did by the thousands. And the Cherokees were an unusual tribe because they were one of the few that actually did adopt Anglo-American customs and ways of life. They developed a phonetic set of symbols that matched their language, and they came up with a printing press. And so, in so many ways, they were on their way to total assimilation with Anglo-American society. But in the end of the day, they were still Native Americans, which was unacceptable to Southerners that lived alongside of them. And so, at the request of the state of Georgia, they were relocated all the way out to Oklahoma area, where their reservations are even today. I like this edition of Tocqueville, but unfortunately, they left out one of the most important historical passages where he describes watching the Trail of Tears. Tocqueville saw it. He was there when he toured across the South. He said that in the whole scene, there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu and goodbye. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil, but they were somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English, and of them I asked why they were leaving their country. And what's interesting is he doesn't say because we're being kicked out. He says, "No, we want to be free," he answered. And I could never get any other reason out of him. Oh, so what did they think was happening here? It's a mystery. I don't really know. But Tocqueville goes on. We watched the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples. Why? Why does it have to be this way? This dislocation. Tocqueville predicts, I just don't see a good end for Native Americans in the future. It's just going to be, they are wiped out. He just couldn't see anything else happening. Well, as we know, it didn't exactly go that way. A lot of the tribes survive. Many of them thrive, and they're doing quite well. Others, less so, come to find out. And one thing, I think one mistake Tocqueville makes is he does sort of generalize the tribes a bit. Each tribe does really have its own unique character, its own mores, you might say. And so some are better capable of governing themselves than others. And but all in all, yeah, it's a major blot on the American Republic. It's hard to reconcile who we say we are with the treatment of these people and what Tocqueville calls these irredeemable crimes. What does that say for us? Does it all just sit on a very shaky foundation? Can we reconcile these actions with our own first principles? That it is self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. That meant a lot, as we know, for the end of slavery. Could it mean the same thing for the situation of Native Americans? We'll consider that more in a minute. But yeah, what about blacks, black slaves in particular? What does he have to say about them? Page 152. He points out, first of all, that they're just their general condition, or sorry, not 152, flip back to 148. Just their general condition is much like the Native Americans, it's dislocation and this feeling of having no sense of belonging to a place, to a family, but to the master. And this is largely because of the way slaves were sold and moved around the country. Families would be broken up, mothers and children separated, fathers and or husbands and wives separated. They had no formal marriage. They had no formal family unit. They were all individuals, and as individuals, they could only see the master, as their only sense of belonging. And so that again, that uprootedness and that sense of dislocation is a major part of all three of the races, as I mentioned a minute ago. And here's why it's that way for slaves. So yeah, how does he describe the situation of the slave and the way they see themselves on page 147? Oppression, he says, has taken away from the descendants of the African in one blow almost all the privileges of humanity, he exclaims. The Negro in the United States has lost even the memory of his country. Right? What does West Africa mean to him? He no longer understands the language his forefathers spoke. He has renounced their religion, and he has forgotten their mores. While thus ceasing to belong to Africa, he has had 148. He has not acquired any of the rights of Europe. He has come to stop between the two societies, this limbo position. He has remained isolated between the two people, sold by one and repudiated by the other. In the entire universe, only the home of his master offers him a fragmentary image of the fatherland. The Negro man has no family. He is unable to see in woman anything other than a temporary companion of his pleasures, and as soon as they are born, children are like his equals. He may not even know who his children are. Everybody broken up into this radically individualistic way of life. Shall I call it an act of grace by God or a final malediction of his anger, God's anger, this disposition of the soul that makes man insensitive to extreme sufferings and often even gives him a sort of depraved liking for the cause of his misfortunes? The fact that slaves were surprisingly jolly and happy-go-lucky, as Northerners come to find out, I'm sure Tocqueville saw this too. You try to think, well, they seem okay, they seem happy, what's the deal? But then you realize that's a coping mechanism. That's a way of dealing with the suffering. So what else do you have to say? That because of this uprootedness, never having families, never being able to settle in one place and feel like you're home and you have a sense of belonging, they develop their own set of mores and more broadly, their own unique culture, ways of coping, ways of surviving. So, what are the great mythologies that come out of slave culture? You've probably heard of them. Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, right? Rabbit is always the hero because he's not the biggest and the strongest. He's not powerful, but he's the slickest. He's the smartest. And so he's a model for the slave mentality of survival in this world where everybody's bigger and stronger than you and they can hurt you. But if you're slick, if you're clever, if you know how to work around things, you survive. And so what else comes to mind? Some of the famous songs that were really, really sophisticated. You think there's one called Follow the Drinking Gourd, and it just sounds like a benign song about a drinking gourd until you find out that the drinking gourd is another name for the constellation where you find the North Star, right? So what does that mean? Follow that North Star, go north. So when the slave runs away, just keep following that North Star as you're going through dense woods and rugged wilderness. If you keep following that star, though, eventually you end up somewhere in the north. So they have this very sophisticated way of cultivating their own unique set of mores that were very survivalist and very rich and spiritual. And he'll have more to say about spirituality later, of Americans in general, but also of blacks. But what else? The whole sense of self-knowledge, though, comes down to an awareness of one's own state of being property. He says on page 148 in the middle. His intelligence is degraded to the level of his soul. The Negro enters into servitude and enters into the world at the same moment. What am I saying? He is often bought from the moment he is in his mother's womb. And he begins, as it were, to be a slave before he's even born, without either need or pleasure, unless to himself he understands with the first notions he gets from life that he is the property of another whose interest it is to look after his life. He's a dependent, he'll always be. He perceives that the concern for his own fate does not devolve upon himself. Right? Being the property of someone else means you'll always be cared for, which in a way sounds nice, but then again, it's also degrading. You're dependent, right? You're never going to be your own person. The use of thought itself seems to him useless, a useless gift of providence, and he peacefully enjoys all the privileges of his servility. So, what does it mean for freed slaves, though? Emancipation wasn't very common, but it did happen. There was actually a wave of emancipation right after the American Revolution and through the early Republic, and then it kind of tapered off. And you wouldn't see it again in large numbers until slave owners didn't voluntarily give up their slaves, but the South lost the Civil War to the Union. What does freedom mean, though, in that situation? If he becomes free, independence often appears to him to be a heavier shackle than slavery itself was. For in the course of his life, he has learned to submit to everything except to reason. And then all of a sudden he's free? Now what? Terrifying. It doesn't make any sense to him. He has to be prepared for freedom. In other words, he has to acclimate to the mores that make other people who are free. But that's hard, and that's a tedious process. Instead, upon the moment of freedom, 1,000 new appetites lay siege to him, and he lacks the enlightenment and the energy to resist those appetites. Appetites are masters, aren't they? And they must be combated, and he has learned only to submit and obey. So before, his appetites were suppressed by the master, by the whole slave system. Once that's all gone, now what suppresses it? His reason has not been activated to do that. It takes practice to do it. So then what? He thus arrives at this height of wretchedness, that servitude brutalizes him and liberty destroys him. Being thrown out there into freedom when you're not prepared is a really, really terrifying and messy process. What else, though, about Southern blacks? And again, he skips around a bit in the way he addresses this, but skip ahead to page 152 again. He goes on and points out that, look, whatever the situation, the destiny of whites and blacks is tied together. Indians will die or have lived in isolation, he says, but the fate of Negroes is in a way bound up with that of Europeans, he means white Americans. The two races are connected to each other without thereby being mixed together. They're not mixed exactly, but they are always close. It is as difficult for them to separate completely as to unite. So you're stuck together. What are you going to do? Is the question. It's precisely that difference between them, plus their closeness, Tocqueville says, that is explosive and dangerous. And he says in that second paragraph, the most fearsome of all evils that threatens the future of the United States arises from the presence of blacks on its soil. And so, yeah, even though they're stuck together, they're also in great, great tension with each other. And as he observed this in America, don't know if he knew about it, he probably did, but you saw the bloodiest slave uprising in the United States in 1831, led by this guy, Nat Turner. You may have heard his name, a highly educated slave who was also known for having these profound spiritual experiences. So remember, like reason and faith, liberty and faith growing up together, as he's mentioned before. And so Nat Turner was highly literate, and his master just decided to educate him when he was a kid. And he grew up very, very eloquent. He would give speeches. He was always very spiritual about it. But one day, he was sure that God had given him the signal to lead a slave revolt. Just start a little bit, and then it will snowball across the South. And pretty soon, all slaves will rise up and assert their freedom. Turner didn't really think, though, about how exactly that would go. He just thought God told him to start it, and then God will do the rest. What happened? He got together a band of followers, and they murdered something like 50 white Virginians in this horrible rampage. They were swiftly caught. Turner was caught, and he was put on trial. And even at his trial, he stood up and just invoked the name of God and the will of God in everything he did. In a lot of ways, he was kind of a precursor to John Brown, the radical abolitionist who came along later in the 1850s, just before the Civil War. Just totally certain of his divine purpose and never repented of it. I'm doing God's will. And he went all the way to his execution for that. What happens if this happens again? What if we get another slave revolt? What if we get a whole bunch at once? It was in response to this, after Turner's revolt, that you saw the Black Code set in across the South. And you saw the states really get in the business of closely regulating the movement of slaves, the activity of slaves, strict restrictions on educating them. You won't see any literate ones anymore, all because of Nat Turner. So Tocqueville called it, though. The greatest danger comes. And he seemed to think, too, that the danger wasn't necessarily civil war, though he does mention that later, but slave revolts. There had been others in Latin America, in places like Haiti, the French colony that had been overthrown by a slave revolt. This was going to be a more and more frequent thing, Tocqueville seemed to think, and it's really, really dangerous. So, what does he say? In general, men need to make great and continual efforts in order to create lasting evils. But there is one evil that penetrates into the world furtively. At first, it is scarcely noticed amid the normal abuses of power. It begins with an individual whose name history does not preserve. It is deposited like an accursed seed in some spot of ground, and then it nourishes itself on its own, and it spreads without effort and grows naturally with the society that has accepted it. And that evil is slavery. Good description, right? The greatest danger to slavery is the way it becomes normalized over time. It's exactly what Jefferson said a few classes ago when we looked at his notes on the state of Virginia, right? It only takes a couple generations of white Southerners to think that this is normal and this is good. And that's it. Slavery becomes fixed and permanent. Even as it festers as an institution and you have these horrible grievances growing up, it calls on the state to step in and impose more laws and more regulations. And at some point, everything just blows up. Tocqueville says Christianity had destroyed slavery, remember, in the Middle Ages. You had serfs, right? But they weren't the same thing as slaves. The Christians of the 16th century, though, reestablished it, especially with the slave trade from West Africa. They never accepted it, however, save as an exception in their social system, and they took care to restrict it to a single one of the human races. There weren't whites enslaving whites anymore, like it was back in the old, Roman Empire. Now it's racial slavery. They thus opened a wound in humanity, Tocqueville says, that was less wide, but infinitely more difficult to heal. So, what does this mean then? It's gonna blow up at some point. Consider Bleeding Kansas, late 1850s, and then finally the Civil War. Tocqueville could really see some kind of major conflict coming, but he points out too that even when slavery's gone someday, and it will be, he knew that it had to end, didn't know how, but it would end. That means it's only illegal. The laws can change any which way, but the mores, they're much harder to change. The bad mores, the attitudes about racial animosity and suspicion. So consider Black Americans, mid 20th century, had all kinds of rights, right? They weren't enslaved anymore. They had property rights and everything, but they were still expected to not sit at the white only counter in the restaurant, not go to the white only hotel, racial segregation in the Jim Crow era. It's a perfect example of what Tocqueville is describing. The mores are strong. The prejudices just don't go away that easily. So he contrasts the race-based slavery of his time with the earlier ancient slavery, where it was much more a socioeconomic class in the Roman Empire, and manumission was common. Slaves would very often be set free in the Roman Empire. It had nothing to do with race. Now, it just so happens that this sense of superior and inferior aligns. with physical distinctions that seem very, very clear in the minds of the superior class. So that means that the mores are going to be deeply attached to that sense of difference, way more than laws ever could be. What was more difficult among the ancients was to modify the law. Among the moderns, it is to change the mores. And for us, the real difficulty begins when that of antiquity ended, page 153. The reason for this is that among the moderns, the spiritual and transient fact of slavery is combined with in the most lethal manner with the material and permanent fact of racial difference. The memory of slavery dishonors race, and race perpetuates the memory of slavery. No African arrived upon the shores of the New World of his own free will, from which it follows that all those who are found there today are slaves or freedmen. Thus, the Negro transmits to all his descendants, along with his life, the external sign of his dishonor. The law can destroy servitude, yeah, but only God can obliterate its traces. No surprise, there was a tremendous turn to God in the civil rights era. Martin Luther King, remember, was a minister of the gospel, and all of his followers, most of his major supporters, were deeply religious. But back to Tocqueville's time, though, how is this dealt with? To justify attitudes towards slavery, to justify the animosity and just the way of life, that was the reason for racism. I always get this backward today. It's amazing how often you hear about kids taught, in woke curriculum that racism came first and then came the slavery. No, it's the other way around. The slavery came first. I don't think there's anything particularly racist about slave catchers. They were just businessmen. And they saw, a get rich quick scheme exploiting other people. It was later, though, that you started to get the elaborate theories of racial types, some being superior to others. A lot of this pioneered in Britain. So there's the famous poster, Principal Varieties of Mankind, right? You can sort of categorize all these racial types. But who's the center of it all? The white European, right? There he is in the middle. But some racism was kind of benign in the sense that it just categorized people and kind of thought people ought to have their own niche and their own place in the world. But with something like slavery, what happens? You start justifying hierarchies, claiming that there are skull shapes. We mentioned, I think, a few classes ago, the pseudoscience of phrenology, right? It's measuring the shape of people's skulls to indicate superior and inferior types. All sort of within a Darwinian context of evolution, one descending from another upward. So, what is the point of all this? It's to justify what people really want to see, whether it's scientific racism, whether it's a certain reading of the Bible. Hey, doesn't Paul say, slaves, submit to your masters? Jesus never talked about abolition, so there you go. It's compatible with Christianity, it was thought. Or just the general sense that this is the Southern way of life. So why mess with it? That was the broader sentiment, I think. So there's the present state. What's the future? What does the future hold? He talks about this tour down the Ohio River. And this is one of the most famous passages from Tocqueville. The fact that the North and the South just have really different ways of life. And he describes them all here in detail. Page 157. You go down the Ohio River, and he did on one of those steamboats that were popular, and look to the north. What does the Ohio side look like in the state of Ohio? It's developed. You see factories. You see people working for wages. You see opportunity and wealth creation. You see a lot of diversity, a lot more immigrants, a lot more different types of people, but all of them assimilating and trying to become part of the American way of life. He calls it, on the northern bank, there's a confused hum, right, on page 157. Proclaimed in the distance, the present of industry. Rich harvests cover the fields. Elegant dwellings speak of the taste and care of the laborer. Prosperity is visible everywhere. There's always a way out of poverty, right? No one's stuck in it. Man appears wealthy and content, and he works. It's honorable to be a worker in the North. Look on the opposite bank, the Kentucky side, the South. And the South, Kentucky wasn't the deep South necessarily, but it's South enough. He says on the southern bank, sorry, I flipped the paragraphs. Look in the middle of 157. On the southern bank of the river, the population is sparse. Lots of woods, lots of open country. And from time to time, one sees a troop of slaves walking across the half deserted field with a casual air. Lots of virgin forest constantly reappearing, not developed, meaning nobody's, pursuing prosperity there. And you remember too, what about Southern whites who don't own slaves? What situation are they in? You can try to make it, right? But anything you do is going to be kind of dishonorable because work is for slaves, right? So if you really want to make something of yourself, you cross that river, you go up to Ohio, and many people did. But those who stay, what is it like? Open space, lots of woods. He said that one would think that society was asleep, whereas on the Ohio side, it's wide awake. Man seems idle, and nature presents the image and activity of life. Nature does, not people. So again, I flipped those paragraphs, sorry, but you see those two. The state of Kentucky was founded, he said, in 1775. The state of Ohio came into being only 12 years later. 12 years in America is more than half a century in Europe. Today, the population of Ohio already exceeds that of Kentucky by 250,000 inhabitants. Kentucky is much older. You'd think it would be more developed, but it's not. Ohio is much newer, and it has far surpassed Kentucky. But what does this mean for the culture of the North and the South? He has a lot to say, again, about the mores. We start off with relatively the same mores as a people. We're, the common Anglo-American sense. But the South goes a whole different direction. It's the deviant side, really. Here's a classic photograph that was colorized later of a group of Southern planters. How do they contrast with like the northern gentleman in his top hat, right? So what does he have to say? On the southern bank of the Ohio, work is mixed up with the idea of slavery. Work? That's what slaves do. Why would I work? I mean, manage, okay, manage the plantation, but actually labor? Labor for your wealth? Nah, slaves do that. On the northern bank, however, with that of the well-being of progress, there is an abased, there it is abased, but here in the north it is honored, he says. On the southern bank of the river, one cannot find workers belonging to the white race. They are afraid of resembling slaves. One must rely on the Negroes to take care of doing the work, all the work. On the northern bank, one would look in vain for an idler. And it's true. Tocqueville mentions elsewhere in this book, he didn't see a single beggar anywhere in the northern states. Maybe we'll catch that passage later, but you'll never see an idler or a bum or anything like that. People like that out west, maybe, but not in the north. The white man extends his activity and his intelligence to all his tasks. So the north, busy, industrial, wealthy, go, go, go. The south, slow, deliberate, ordered, and structured. And the attitude toward work tends to differ. Work in the north is all about the money you can make off of it. Work in the south is for a certain class of people that the upper crust distinguish themselves from. And remember, too, in the South, right, it's not just like white slave owners, black slaves. It's more of a three-layered system. You have plantation owners at the top, slaves at the bottom, and in the middle, you have the poor white Southerner who probably doesn't own slaves. And they see themselves in a situation of being in class envy with the plantation class at the top, right? But at least they're not slaves, tends to be the attitude. He points out too that the slave is low skilled usually. Some could be more highly skilled, but usually it was just working in the fields, picking the cotton, right? But they're more expensive. In contrast with laborers in the north, they are more highly skilled, but less expensive. You pay them more in proportion to what good a job they do, right? The slave is the same no matter what. They don't get paid anything, of course. But still, if to own a slave, he has to be educated at least to do his work. Got to feed him, got to care for him, got to clothe him. That gets expensive. The worker in the north, none of that. You just pay him a salary, right? But there's a soul difference between these people, as he points out. The northern attitude of industry makes him much more concerned about material well-being, of aspiring upwards. And Tocqueville says in 158, it is the principal aim of his life. He'll have more to say about American materialism. And so, as a result, who do you find across the North? This wide diversity of professions. People just sort of finding their niche in industry, whether it's working with your hands as a blacksmith or a tanner or whatever, or higher skills like a sailor, maybe a pioneer, prospector out west, a manufacturer, a farmer, bearing the work of the dangers attached to these different occupations with unchanging steadfastness. There is something wonderful in the resourcefulness of his nature and a sort of heroism in his enthusiasm for gain. But the American in the South, on the other side of the river, disdains not only work, but all enterprises that would cause that work causes to succeed. So what's weird is he just doesn't really care about success. Yeah, the plantation class cares about wealth, but the slaves generate that for them by growing cotton, which then gets sold, by the way, not so much to the North, but where? To England, right? We talked about that before with the tariffs. Living in idle comfort, he says, page 159, the Southerner has the tastes of idle men. Money has lost a portion of its worth in his eyes. He pursues not so much fortune as excitement and pleasure, and he brings to this side of things the energy that his neighbor deploys elsewhere. And so, for that reason, the Southerner loves hunting and war with a passion. He takes pleasure in the most violent bodily exercises. Southerners are well known for being kind of, cool and friendly in Southern hospitality. But if they're offended, they're ready to go duel in the streets with people. Duels were much more common among Southerners than Northerners. The Southerner is familiar with the use of arms, and from his childhood, he has learned to risk his life in individual combat. Slavery thus not only prevents whites from making their fortune, it turns them away from even wishing to do so. And so there's a tremendous gap, Tocqueville says, culturally, between these two sides, between the northern whites and southern whites. And slavery truly is the thing that creates that gap. And who wandered away, according to Tocqueville? It wasn't that the two parts of the country grew up differently. He said, no, they all started off with kind of the same mores and the same trajectory. It was the South that wandered away. Slavery was the wedge that separated them from Northern mores and customs. And they do this in all kinds of ways, culturally and politically. And you can see where this is headed with civil war in the coming years. He observes, lastly, on page 160, that the South is stuck with slavery. At the same time, slavery is very dangerous to the South, right? The possibility of slave uprisings, the possibility of it settling in and becoming more and more a normal thing, plus just how economically inefficient it is. You just mentioned how expensive slaves are to keep and care for Southern plantation owners. Plus the fact that, is the South able to industrialize? Not at all. There were some pockets of industry in the cities, but nothing like it was in the North. And so that means less opportunity for the poor white Southerner. That means less ability of the South to have material gain and to grow. And so they become very, very dependent on imported goods, either from the North or more often from England. And so that was kind of the deal. Cotton would go to the textile industries in England, and in return, industrial goods would come back to the South. Meanwhile, Northerners just did it all themselves. So again, they were the ones who wandered away, and slavery was the thing that did it. And so, as Tocqueville says in bottom page 160, slavery is stuck there. And at the same time, it is very, very dangerous. In fact, Thomas Jefferson observed exactly that back in 1820. As it is, we have the wolf by the ears. And he said this many times in letters and writings, a wolf by the ears. And we can neither hold on to that wolf nor safely let him go, right? So the longer you've got him by the ear, the angrier he gets, but then the sooner you let him go, the more quickly he eats you. So it is with slavery, he says. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation is in the other. What do you do? Great description. This is exactly why. Remember, he said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. So yeah, Tocqueville says, bottom page 160, It is not that all inhabitants of the South regard slavery as necessary or to the wealth of the master. On this point, many of them are in agreement with the Northerners and readily admit with the latter that slavery is an evil. At least they did in the 1830s. As we know, that changes in the coming years. But they think that it is necessary to maintain this evil in order to live. Enlightenment and increasing the South has made the inhabitants of this part of the country see that slavery is harmful to the master. And the same enlightenment shows them more clearly that they have seen up till then the near impossibility of abolishing it. It's embedded in Southern life. It can't go away. And yet at the same time, it's a profound evil. It's economically inefficient and it's dangerous. And yet it's not going away, at least not easily. He points out that the legislation of Southern states very often recognizes this, and it's drafted in a way that's desperate. The slave codes and the regulations of the states and everything, trying to keep it, but at the same time, realize what a problem it truly is. He says in the middle of 161, the ancients knew only about shackles and death for maintaining slavery, but the Americans of the South of the Union have discovered more intellectual guarantees for the perpetuation of their power. They have, if I may express myself thus, spiritualized despotism and violence. Right? It's a great description of the intellectual basis of racism in whether science or religion in this case. Southerners have, if I may express myself thus, spiritualized despotism and violence, he says. In antiquity, in the ancient world, one sought to prevent the slave from breaking his shackles. In our day, one has tried to deprive him of even the desire to do so, to degrade slavery so much, to degrade the slaves so much that they don't even perceive their situation anymore. The ancients enchained the body of the slave, but they left the spirit free and permitted him to acquire learning. There are some very highly educated slaves in ancient Rome and Greece. Aesop, who wrote the stories of the talking animals, people like that. But, not so when it comes to American slaves, unless you consider Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. But in that, they are consistent with themselves. There was at that time a natural end to servitude. One day or the other, the slave might become free in the ancient world and then equal to his master. He might have been equal to his master to begin with. Not in the American South. In the South, who do not think that the Negroes can ever merge with them, they have forbidden them under severe penalties to be taught to read or write. Not wishing to raise them to their level, they keep them close as possible to the brutes. So, it's a mix. It's evil, and yet it's necessary for the order and stability of Southern society. All that said, though, Tocqueville said it's got to end somehow. There's no way this institution can carry on, not just because of moral objections, but because, again, it's economically unfeasible. The South will just drive itself into economic ruin because of this institution. They can't industrialize. And you're going to get huge classes of poor white Southerners who are completely shut out from any kind of opportunity. If they don't go north, they're going to turn all their hatred against the plantation class. And then you'll have slave revolts, and then, it's got to end somehow. It can't last. It can't last. But when? He just doesn't know. But what he can say for the moment, what is occurring in the South, 162 in the middle, what is occurring in the South of the Union seems to me to be at once the most horrible and most natural consequence of slavery. When I see the order of nature overturned, when I hear humanity crying out and struggling in vain under the laws, I confess that I do not find myself in the indignation to denounce the men of our day who are responsible for these outrages. I mean, look, if it's all about power and we just accept that there's a superior class and inferior class and whatever, it's awful, but there's really no basis for objection, Tocqueville says, because that's just what it is. But what happens when it's a nation founded on this assertion, this affirmation of human dignity in the Declaration of Independence? Then, Tocqueville says, I confess that I do not find in myself the indignation to denounce the men, but I concentrate all my hatred, I meant to say, all my hatred against those who, after more than 1,000 years of growing equality, have introduced slavery once again into the world. But, he says, it cannot last. After all, this spread of democracy and equality, like I said at the beginning of the book, is the will of God. And it's God's intention that it spread. It must spread to this too. How, though? I mean, it's just like training democracy in general. You're going to have to think about exactly how slavery is going to end, he says to American readers and really to the world. Well, it so happens we know the story. Abraham Lincoln becomes president in 1860, takes office in 1861, and immediately the South secedes. Lincoln responds and preserves the Union, but in the course of doing that, emancipates slaves. You have a long stretch of Jim Crow laws after the Civil War and brutal discrimination, finally the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. But throughout that, there's sort of this aspiration to live up to our own stated principles. And it's been hard and a long way to go still. And a lot of pessimism about America completely with the 1619 Project we heard about, critical race theory and everything. But still, we have this guiding star. We have this aspiration that really checks everything we say we are and helps us live up to our nobler goals. Is it broad racial equality? You could put it that way, but what was it for Lincoln? What was it for Martin Luther King? We looked at the letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. What was it? It was just basic rights of every person, not total racial equality, but just fulfillment of that basic promise of the American regime and the principles of the Declaration of Independence that no one has a God-given right to rule over someone else without their consent. That's it. So, what does this mean for the future of the Union? What does he have to say about the chances of its survival? Slavery, he says, again, has the marked difference between the North and the South, Northern and Southern culture, and their mores and their customs. He mentions again the fact that Southerners, again, started with the same mores as Northerners, but they went their own direction. They separated. Southern character, as a result, he comes back to this on 163, is what? It's all about the domestic dictatorship, the master of the home, which includes the master over the slaves. The first notion he receives about life announces to him, the white Southerner, at least one who owns slaves, that he is born to command, and that the first habit he acquires is that of easily dominating. So his education tends powerfully to make the Southern American haughty, rash, irascible, violent, ardent in his desires, impatient in his obstacles, but easily discouraged if he cannot triumph on the first try. In contrast, the Northerner, with his old Puritan roots, with his industrial habits, what is he like? The American of the North sees no slave running around his cradle. He never grew up with it, thinking it was somehow normal. He does not even encounter free servants because most often he's constrained to provide for his own needs by himself. Much stronger attitude of self-reliance and do-it-yourself in the North than there is in the South. Scarcely is he even in the world when the idea of necessity comes from all directions to present itself to his mind. He thus learns early to recognize exactly through his own efforts the natural limits of his power. He does not expect to bend by the force and wills that are opposed to his own, and he knows that in order to obtain the aid of his fellow men, the Northerner must, above all, win their good will. And so for that reason, the Northerner is patient, thoughtful, tolerant, slow to act, persevering in his goals. Flip back to the Southerner, he says, what? The Southerner is not preoccupied with material cares of life because someone else does it for him. And so for that reason, he's all about grandeur, luxury, glory, pleasures, and idleness, disdain for work. Why would I work, right? Other than, hunting and fighting or whatever. The Northerner, to flip back again, the great contrast here in 164, is always in this struggle against poverty. Whatever he has, he worked for it, right? And he learns to put material comfort above the pleasures of the mind and heart. Concentrated upon the small details of life, His imagination fades, his ideas are fewer and less general, but they become more practical, clearer, and more precise. He's about profit and making it in life. The Northern has not only experience, but knowledge. Nevertheless, he does not prize science as a pleasure. He esteems it as a means, you know, building better machines, industry, progress, right? And he seizes eagerly on useful applications. Back to the Southerner. He is spontaneous, full of spirit, more open, more generous, more intellectual, and more dazzling, whereas the Northerner is more active, more reasonable, more enlightened, and more adroit. So back and forth and back and forth. And again, the pivot of all this difference is the institution of slavery. There's the slave pulling the map of North and South apart. What does the future hold when people go down such radically different paths in life? He sees only conflict coming, whether it's massive slave revolts or some kind of civil war. Tocqueville called it. Of course, as we know, it was civil war. So he elaborates on that a bit more, but we'll leave it at that. He entertains the possibility of aristocracy reappearing. Could that be the answer? Does democracy sort of lead down this dangerous new road, and so we go back? I think that was one of the discussion questions earlier. But Tocqueville says no. Aristocracy is finished off. Democracy succeeds completely. But who's on the wrong side of that movement of history here? It's obviously the Southerner, who does not embrace democracy in the same way, who fancies himself a kind of neo-aristocrat because he's a slave owner. Cannot be true. So that's the end of volume 1 of Democracy in America. Here he talks, as we know, about the big, broad questions of American civilization and this chapter on race and what it means for the future. Volume 2, beginning on page 169, he descends down to more particular aspects of American life. And here's where he talks about the real sources of the mores and the way they play out in the way Americans think. So next time, yeah, let's consider the philosophic method of the Americans. What is philosophy in the United States? The sources of our beliefs. Where do we what inclines us to believe certain things? And then, of course, democracy and religion, which is something he's already touched on in chapter 9, the previous chapter 9, in volume 2 or volume 1. But he comes back to that more and considers religion on its own as a thing that maintains mores and also shapes certain ideas about democracy and takes on a uniquely American form, American spirituality. So yeah, let's consider that next time, and I'll see you then.